Good morning. Like yesterday, I will use my facial mask from Nature Republic, Real Nature Masjid Bamboo. And now we will learn theory about yoga. Yesterday we learned about ballet. Now we learn about yoga. Okay, let's learn about yoga now. Let's start. Yoga is a group of physical, mental, and spiritual practices or disciplines which originated in ancient India and aim to control and still the mind. Recognizing a detached witness consciousness untouched by the mind and mundane suffering. There is a wide variety of schools of yoga, practices, and goals in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, and traditional and modern yoga is practiced worldwide. Yoga-like practices were first mentioned in the ancient Hindu text known as Rig Veda. Yoga is referred to in a number of the Upanishads. The first known appearance of the word yoga with the same meaning as the modern term is in the Katha Upanishad, which was probably composed between the 5th and 3rd centuries BCE. Yoga continued to develop as a systematic study and practice during the 5th and 6th centuries BCE in ancient India ascetic and Shramana movements. The most comprehensive text on yoga, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, date to the early centuries of the Common Era. Yoga philosophy became known as one of the 6 orthodox philosophical schools of Hinduism in the second half of the 1st millennium CE. Hatha Yoga texts began to emerge between the 9th and 11th centuries, originating in Tantra. Two general theories exist on the origins of yoga. The linear model holds that yoga originated in the Vedic period, as reflected in the Vedic textual corpus, and influenced Buddhism. According to author Edward Fitzpatrick Krengle, this model is mainly supported by Hindu scholars. According to the synthesis model, yoga is a synthesis of non-Vedic and Vedic elements. This model is favored in Western scholarship. The term yoga in the Western world often denotes a modern form of Hatha Yoga and a posture-based physical fitness, stress relief, and relaxation techniques, consisting largely of asanas. It differs from traditional yoga, which focuses on meditation and release from worldly attachments. It was introduced by gurus from India after the success of Swami Vivekananda's adaptation of yoga without asanas in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Vivekananda introduced the Yoga Sutras to the West, and they became prominent after the 20th century success of Hatha Yoga. The Sanskrit noun yoga is derived from the root yuds, to attach, join, harness, yoke. Yoga is a cognate of the English word yoke. According to Michael Burley, the first use of the root of the word yoga is in hymn of the Rig Veda, a dedication to the rising sun god, where it has been interpreted as yoke or control. Panini wrote that the term yoga can be derived from either or two roots, Yujir Yoga or Yud Samadao. In the context of the Yoga Sutras, the root Yud Samadao is considered the correct etymology by traditional commentators. In accordance with Panini, Vyasa says that yoga means samadhi. In the Yoga Sutras, Kriya Yoga is yoga's practical aspect, the union with the Supreme in the performance of everyday duties. A person who practices yoga or follows the yoga philosophy with a high level of commitment is called a yogi. A female yogi may also be known as yogini. The ultimate goals of yoga are stilling the mind and gaining insight, resting in detached awareness, and liberation from samsara and dukkha. A process leading to unity with the divine or with oneself. This goal varies by philosophical or theological system. In the classic Ashtanga yoga system, the ultimate goal of yoga is to achieve samadhi and remain in that state as pure awareness. According to Knut A. Jacobsen, yoga has 5 principal meanings: a disciplined method for attaining a goal, techniques of controlling the body and mind, a name of a school or system of philosophy, with prefixes such as hatha, mantra, and laya, traditions specializing in particular yoga techniques, the goal of yoga practice. David Gordon Watt writes that yoga's core principles were more or less in place in the 5th century CE, and variations of the principles developed over time. A meditative means of discovering dysfunctional perception and cognition, as well as overcoming it to release any suffering, find inner peace and salvation. Illustration of this principle is found in Hindu texts such as the Bhagavad Gita and Yoga Sutras, in a number of Buddhist Mahayana works, as well as Jain texts. The raising and expansion of consciousness from oneself to being coextensive with everyone and everything. These are discussed in sources such as in Hinduism, Vedic literature, and its epic Mahabharata, the Jain Prasamarati Prakarana, and Buddhist Nikaya texts. A path to omniscience and enlightened consciousness, enabling one to comprehend the impermanent and permanent reality. Examples of this are found in Hinduism Nyaya and Vaisesika school texts, as well as Buddhism Madhyama texts, but in different ways. A technique for entering into other bodies, generating multiple bodies, and the attainment of other supernatural accomplishments. These are stage-wide, described in Tantric literature of Hinduism and Buddhism, as well as the Buddhism Samanapala Sutra. James Mallinson, however, disagrees and suggests that such spring practices are far removed from the mainstream yoga school as meditation-driven means to liberation in Indian religions. According to White, the last principle relates to legendary goals of yoga practice. It differs from yoga practical goals in South Asian thought and practice since the beginning of the Common Era in Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain philosophical schools. There is no consensus on yoga's chronology or origins other than its development in ancient India. There are two broad theories explaining the origins of yoga. The linear model holds that yoga has Vedic origins and influenced Buddhism. This model is mainly supported by Hindu scholars. According to the synthesis model, yoga is a synthesis of indigenous non-Vedic practices with Vedic elements. This model is favored in Western scholarship. Speculation about yoga began to emerge in the early Upanishads of the first half of the first millennium BCE, with exposition also appearing in Jain and Buddhist texts. Between 200 BCE and 500 CE, traditions of Hindu, Buddhist, Jain philosophy were taking shape. Teachings were collected as sutras and a philosophical system of Patanjali Yoga Sastra began to emerge. The Middle Age saw the development of a number of yoga satellite traditions. It and other aspects of Indian philosophy came to the attention of the educated Western public during the mid-19th century. According to Edward Fitzpatrick Kringle, Hindu researchers have favored a linear theory which attempts to interpret the origin and early development of Indian contemplative practices as a sequential growth from an Aryan genesis. Traditional Hinduism regards the Vedas as the source of all spiritual knowledge. Edwin Bryan wrote that authors who support indigenous Aryanism also tend to support the linear model. Henry Zimmer was an exponent of the synthesis model, arguing for non-Vedic Eastern states of India. According to Zimmer, yoga is part of a non-Vedic system which includes the Samkhya school of Hindu philosophy, Jainism, and Buddhism. Doesn't derive from Brahman Aryan sources, but reflects the cosmology and anthropology of a much older pre-Aryan upper class of northeastern India, being rooted in the same subsoil of archaic metaphysical speculation as yoga, Sankhya, and Buddhism, the other non-Vedic Indian system. Richard Gombrich and Geoffrey Samuel believe that the Shramana movement originated in non-Vedic Greater Magadha. Thomas McAfee favors a composite model in which a pre-Aryan yoga prototype existed in the pre-Vedic period and was refined during the Vedic period. According to Kevin DeFloat, the Upanishads differs fundamentally from the Vedic ritual tradition and indicate non-Vedic influences. However, the tradition may be connected. The ascetic traditions of the Eastern Ganges Plain are thought to draw from a common body of practices and philosophies, with Proto-Samkhya concepts of Purusa and Prakriti as a common denominator. Indus Valley civilization. The 20th century scholars Carol Werner, Thomas McAfee, and Mircea Eliade believe that the central figure of the Pasupati is in a Mula Bandhasana posture, and the roots of yoga are in the Indus Valley civilization. This is rejected by more recent scholarship. For example, Geoffrey Samuel, Andrea R.J., and Wendy Doniger describe the identification as speculative. The meaning of the figure will remain unknown until Harapan script is deciphered, and the roots of yoga cannot be linked of the IVC. Earliest references: the Vedas, the only text preserved from the early Vedic period and codified between 1200 and 900 BCE, contain references to yogic practices primarily related to ascetics outside or on the fringes of Brahmanism. The Rig Veda's Nasadiya Sukta suggests an early Brahmanic contemplative tradition. Techniques for controlling breath and vital energy are mentioned in the Atharva Veda and in the Brahmanas. According to Flood, the Samhitas contain some references to ascetics, namely the Munis, Orcasians, and the Vratyas. Werner wrote in 1977 that the Rig Veda doesn't describe yoga, and there is little evidence of practices. The earliest description of an outsider who doesn't belong to the Brahminic establishment is found in the Kasin hymn, the Rig Veda youngest book, which was codified around 1000 BCE. Werner wrote that there were individuals who were active outside the trend of Vedic mythological creativity and the Brahminic religious orthodoxy, and therefore little evidence of their existence. Practices and achievement has survived, and such evidence as is available in the Vedas themselves is scanty and indirect. Nevertheless, the indirect evidences is strong enough not to allow any doubt about the existence of spiritually highly advanced wanderers. According to Witcher, scholarship frequently fails to see the connection between the contemplative practices of the rishis and later yoga practices. The proto-yoga of the Vedic rishis is an early form of sacrificial mysticism and contains many elements characteristic of later yoga that include concentration, meditative observation, ascetic forms of practice, breath control practice in conjunction with the recitation of sacred hymn during the ritual, the notion of self-sacrifice, impeccably accurate recitation of sacred words, mystical experience, and the engagement with a religion far greater than our psychological identifier or the ego. Jacobson wrote in 2018, bodily postures are closely related to the tradition of ascetic practices in the Vedic tradition. Ascetic practices used by Vedic priests in their preparations for the performance of the sacrifice may be precursors of yoga. The ecstatic practice of enigmatic long-haired Muni in Rig Veda and the ascetic performance of the Vratya in the Atharva Veda outside of or on the fringe of the Brahmanical ritual order have probably contributed more to the aesthetic practices of yoga. According to Bryan, practices recognizable as classical yoga first appear in the Upanishads. Alexander Wynne agrees that formless elemental meditation may have originated in the Upanishadic tradition. An early reference to meditation is made in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishads, one of the principal Upanishads. The Chandogya Upanishads describes the 5 vital energies and concept of later yoga traditions are also described in these Upanishads. The practice of pranayama is mentioned in hymn of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishads, and pratyahara is mentioned in hymn of Chandogya Upanishads. The Jaminiya Upanishad Brahmana teaches breath control and repetition of a mantra. The Taittiriya Upanishads defines yoga as the mastery of body and senses. According to Flood, the actual term yoga first appears in the Katha Upanishads, date to 5th to 1st centuries BCE. Second, urbanization. Systematic yoga concepts began to emerge in texts dating to 500 until 200 BCE, such as the early Buddhist texts, the Middle Upanishads, and the Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita, and Santi Parva. Buddhism and the Sramana movement. According to Jeffrey Samuel, the best evidence to date suggests that yogic practices developed in the same ascetic circles as the early Sramana movements, probably in around the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. This occurred during India's second urbanization period. According to Mallinson and Singleton, this tradition were the first to use mind-body techniques, but later described as yoga, to strive for liberation from the round of rebirth. Werner writes, the Buddha was the founder of his system, even though admittedly he made use of some of the experiences he had previously gained under various yoga teachers of this time, he notes. But it is only with Buddhism itself, as expounded in the Pali Canon, that we can speak about a systematic and comprehensive or even integral school of yoga practice, which is thus the first and oldest to have been preserved for us in its entirety. Early Buddhist texts describe yogic and meditative practices, some of which the Buddha borrowed from the Sramana tradition. The Pali Canon contains 3 passages in which the Buddha describes pressing the tongue against the palate to control hunger of the mind, depending on the passage. There is no mention of the tongue inserted into the nasopharynx as in Kekari Mudra. The Buddha used a posture in which pressure is put on the perineum with the heel, similar to the modern postures used to evoke Kundalini. Suttas which discuss yogic practice include the Satipatthana Sutta and the Anapanati Sutta. The chronology of these yoga-related early Buddhist texts, like the ancient Hindu texts, is unclear. Early Buddhist sources such as the Majjhima Nikaya mention meditation. The Anguttara Nikaya describes giants who resemble early Hindu descriptions of Muni. The Kazen and meditation aesthetics, but the meditation practices are not called yoga in this text. The earliest known discussion of yoga in Buddhist literature, as understood in a modern context, are from the later Buddhist Yogacara and Theravada schools. Jain meditation is a yoga system which predated the Buddhist school. Since Jain sources are later than Buddhist ones, however, it is difficult to distinguish between the early Jain school and elements derived from other schools. Most of the other contemporary yoga systems alluded to in the Upanishads and some Buddhist texts has been lost. Upanishads. The Upanishads, composed in the late Vedic period, contains the first references to practices recognizable as classical yoga. The first known appearance of the word yoga in the modern sense is in the Katha Upanishad, where it is defined as steady control of the senses which, with cessation of mental activity, leads to a supreme state. The Katha Upanishad integrates the monism of the early Upanishads with concept of Samkhya and Yoga. It defines level of existence by their proximity to one's innermost being. Yoga is viewed as a process of interiorization or ascent of consciousness. The Upanishads is the earliest literary work which highlights the fundamental of yoga. According to Webb, the earliest extant systematic account of yoga and a bridge from the earlier Vedic uses of the term is found in the Hindu Katha Upanishad, a scripture dating from about the 10th century BCE. It describes the hierarchy of mind-body constituents, the senses, mind, intellect, that comprise the foundational categories of Samkhya philosophy, whose metaphysical system grounds the yoga of the Yoga Sutras, Bhagavad Gita, and other texts and schools. The hymn in Book 2 of the Svetasvatra Upanishads describe a procedure in which the body is upright, the breath is restrained, and the mind is meditatively focused, preferably in a cave or a place that seems simple and quiet. The Maitrayaniya Upanishad, probably composed later than the Katha and Svetavastara Upanishad, but before the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, mentions a sixfold yoga method: breath control, introspective withdrawal of the senses, meditation, mental concentration, logic and reasoning, and spiritual union. In addition to discussion in the principal Upanishads, the 20 Yoga Upanishads and related texts discuss yoga methods. Macedonian texts. Alexander the Great reached India in the 4th century BCE. In addition to his army, he brought Greek academics who wrote memoirs about its geography, people, and customs. One of Alexander's companions was one Cicitrus, who describes yogis. One Cicitrus says that the yogis were alive and adopted different postures, standing or sitting or lying naked and motionless. One Cicitrus also mentions an attempt by his colleague Calanus to meet them. Initially denied an audience, he was later invited because he was sent by a king curious of wisdom of philosophy. Once Citrus and Calanus learned that the yogis consider life-based doctrines to rid the spirit of not only pain but also pleasure, that man trains the body for toil in order that his opinions may be strengthened, that there is no shame in life of frugal fare, and that the best place to inhabit is one with scantiest equipment or outfit. According to Charles Rockwell Landman, these principles are significant in the history of yoga, spiritual side, and may reflect the roots of undisturbed calmness and mindfulness through balance in the later works of Patanjali and Buddhaghosa. Okay, this is the part 1 of yoga theory. I will return back and explain the theory again later.